Coxey, 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 Coxey. Coxey, 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 Coxey.
Thank you.
I love you, Coxey.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the Constitution of the United States guarantees to all citizens the right to peaceably assemble and petition for redress of grievances.
Furthermore,
Declares that the right of free speech shall not be infringed. In the greatest publicity stunt to its day, he marched to the Capitol. He crossed over 400 miles of terrain. Starting from a group of just one, they quickly grew to 500 and they became an army. It was not a war that they wanted. It was a war that they needed. Through difficulties and distress. A march unstained by even the slightest act, which would bring the blush of shame to any that we are law-abiding citizens. And as men, our actions speak louder than words. We are here to petition for legislation which will furnish employment for every man able and willing to work. For legislation which will bring universal prosperity and emancipate our beloved country from financial bondage to the descendants of King George.
The colorful Jacob Seckler Coxey Sr. was a single man with a single idea. He was a wealthy populist who owned a sand quarry, bred horses, and wore hand-tailored suits. At an estimated net worth of $250,000, General Coxey of Massillon, Ohio, led the Army of the Commonwealth in Christ, more commonly known as Coxey's Army, twice, first on the Easter Sunday of 1894 and the next time 20 years later. Exactly half of a century later, after his first march, May 1st, 1944, at the age of 90, Coxey would stand at the stairs of the U.S. Capitol building.
Of the toiling wealth producers have been denied. We have come through toil and weary marches to lay out our grievances at the doors of the national legislature and ask that they should heed the voice of despair and distress that is now coming up from every section of our country.
Coxey had lived to witness countless marches on Washington, see his ideas adopted by President Roosevelt, and give the speech he had prepared for 50 years ago. He will die at the age of 97.
Coxey's march occurred in 1894, but issues leading up to the radical event began a year before during the huge panic of 1893. In 1893, overextended railroads along with business failures led to a depression that shocked the entire working class. The collapse of the railroad, over 77 railroad lines crashed, followed by the downfall of the National Courage Company, created a crash in the stock market, as many banks, over 500, and 15,000 businesses began to close. The closing of many large businesses resulted in less workers, as unemployment rates reached 25% in some areas. Many workers, now workless, went out to look for work, and many ended up with no food and nowhere to stay. Vagrancy laws forced many into jail, as New York itself had over 20,000 homeless and thousands in jail. People were angry. What was once an economic boom now had a different kind of booming, a boom of poverty. We are engaged in a bitter and cruel war with the enemies of all mankind. A war with hunger, wretchedness, and despair. And we ask Congress to heed our petition and issue for the nation's good a sufficient volume of the same kind of money which carried the country through one awful war and saved the life of the nation.
The president at the time, Grover Cleveland, stubbornly refused to allow the government to support the people. Ironically, on the other hand, he thought it was a responsibility of the people to do whatever possible to help the government. However, all Coxey wanted was to have the government employ the unemployed, to promote a national project to fix the national roads. His good road idea asked for the federal government to create a fund of $500 million to build the national roads. Out with poverty and panic, plenty and peace to replace it.
That winter had been very wet. The roads were so muddied that my buggy kept getting stuck. And all the time I was driving in, I'd see men tramping by, looking for work. Well, it just didn't seem good sense. There were all these men
who needed work, and here were roads needing fixing. The logical thing was for the government to get them together, but the problem was to pay them. When I got home, I sat down and wrote out my plan.
Coxey's army was by no means a military army. Some mistake it as just a protest by citizens. However, this was an army at war with their government. Coxey's army was, although a homeless and ragtag group of unemployed workers, a group of angry men who believed in the march, a common idea by author Carlos A. Schwantz in Coxey's Army, an American Odyssey. This unemployed army marched to Washington, D.C. in 1894, starting from Massillon, Ohio, with a mere 100 men, quickly growing to about 500 men. While Jacob Coxey and his supporters came from Ohio, others came from all over, like Oregon and Pennsylvania. Along the road to D.C., passing by Pittsburgh and many other places, many more workers joined in the march. This random group of misfits, who all marched to D.C. together, who walked 15 miles a day, who were even fed along the walk, had nothing in common besides the need for jobs. This collective march to the American headquarters was known as Coxey's March. Although only 500 arrived at the capital, as many as 20,000 participated in the march. For example, in 2 Beaver County communities, Coxey said, "The reception and cheering were pleasant in Beaver Falls, where a warmly enthusiastic crowd applauded the marchers and took up a collection of $50 or more to help along the cause, while one of the hotels gave free lodgings to the officers. Many other people would help the army by rallying them on and providing support. Newspapers would keep track of the army's progress and post updates regarding the army. This army was making national news and by extension a national impact."
Massillon businessman Jacob S. Coxey is sponsoring a march of unemployed men to Washington, D.C. in order to deliver his Good Roads bill to the Congress. Coxey himself will give a speech from the Capitol steps in support of the bill.
Coxey's army was so popular in its time that, on April 1984, 650 unemployed workers left Seattle as the Northwestern Industrial Army. They planned to ride to the rails of the Northern Pacific East and join Coxey's main army. They paraded through the streets of Seattle and received supports of food and funds. However, when the army was unable to negotiate free rides with the Northern Pacific, they resorted to stealing rides. 200 U.S. soldiers were sent to patrol the train. This Northwestern Industrial Army was seized and arrested, and their attempt to join Coxey's army failed. However, their attempt and huge fame made it obvious just how many supporters there were for Coxey's march to D.C.
Coxey's army, upon arriving at the capital, were met with 15,000 soldiers and policemen. Police were ordered to use their clubs freely in order to stop the mob. An 1882 law required protesters to acquire permission from the Vice President or the Speaker of the House before setting foot on Capitol ground. Despite the police, Coxey and some of his followers jumped the fence. Coxey and Carl Brown, another leading figure who helped organize Coxey's army, had both hidden among the crowd trying to make their way to the steps. Brown was spotted and police surrounded him. He was beaten to the ground. Amongst the chaos, nervous officers started to strike random men, women, and even children. As Coxey reached the steps, police dragged him back. He was followed by a crowd of over 10,000, all chanting his name.
Gradually, thousands of voices joined in.
Coxey! Coxey! Coxey!
Eventually, Coxey and his lieutenant were jailed for 20 days for illegal banners on the Capitol ground and fined $5 for walking on the grass. His army dispersed. The march had failed.
The original march was by no means successful. Coxey and Brown had wanted to gather 100,000 or more protesters, but had only gathered a measly 500 along with some onlookers. Stuck in prison for 20 days and with a $5 fine, Coxey went home unsuccessful but not discouraged. We stand here today in behalf of millions of toilers whose petitions have been buried in committee rooms, whose prayers have been unresponded to, and whose opportunities for honest, remunerative, productive labor have been taken from them by unjust legislation, which protects idlers, speculators, and gamblers. We come to remind the Congress here assembled of the Declaration of the United States Senator, that for a quarter of a century the rich have been growing richer, the poor poorer, and that by the close of the present century the middle class will have disappeared, as the struggles for existence become fierce and relentless. One effect of Coxey's march was the popular phrase, "enough food to feed Coxey's army," as it became an expression as hunger was a great motivating factor for the army. The phrase describes how there is more than enough food, and signifies how little food Coxey's army had during his march. The phrase today, although is used by people who have no clue who Coxey is, reminds people of how bad the Panic of 1893 was, and how little goods the people at the time had. The people at the time were angry, and they believed enough food was being produced, just not enough was being given to the poor. Even today, we still remember the amount of suffering the people of 1893 went through, all because of Coxey's march. The original march ended as a failure, but its legacy left inspiration for subsequent marches to the capital. Although Coxey's march failed, it succeeded in voicing the public's growing apprehension. Due to Coxey's struggles, unions grew in strength and more active forms of protests were performed for the sake of America. That same year, the Pullman strike, influenced by Coxey's army, led to the nationwide strike on railroads. Coxey's protest in Boots marked the first time in our history that common Americans banded together for a new style of protest, a social action that would be exercised by Americans again and again throughout our history, from veteran marches like the Bonus Army to gay marriage protests today. Thanks to Coxey's initial bravery, reforms have been achieved and Americans can live comfortably today. Populist Jacob Coxey's march wasn't just a small 1894 stroll, but a fight for workers throughout the ages.
So we decided to do a small experiment and see if people knew what Coxey's Army is.
So, have you ever heard of Coxey's Army?
Sorry?
Coxey's Army.
Who?
Coxey's Army. Have you ever heard of Coxey's Army? Okay, what is this? Okay, so, have you ever heard of Coxey's Army? No. Have you ever heard of Coxey's Army?
No.
Thank you. Alright. Have you ever heard of Coxey's Army?
No?
Have you ever heard of Coxey's Army? So have you ever heard of Coxey's Army?
Sounds familiar.
Wait, so do you have any idea what it might be?
No.
Alright,
Have you ever heard of Coxey's Army?
What army?
Coxey's Army?
No.
Alright, thank you.